There's something shattering in the eyes of a parent when their own child, the same child who once whispered mommy or daddy with warmth, now spits words laced with contempt, as if they were poison. What was once a home full of affection suddenly becomes a psychological battlefield. And you ask yourself, what did I do wrong? But what if I told you that maybe, just maybe, you're doing something that feeds their contempt without even realizing it? Freud wouldn't label this behavior as mere teenage rebellion. To him, it would be a symbolic act, an unconscious projection of internal conflict. A child's contempt is not random. It's a language, a cry encoded in defense mechanisms, expressing hidden fears, unmet needs, and repressed emotions. And the way you respond could either heal those wounds or deepen them. Can you feel the gravity of that? This is not about discipline, it's about destiny. Picture this. Your child, in a moment of defiance, is not simply being disrespectful. They're screaming for boundaries, for reflection, for someone strong enough not to fight back but to understand. And you, the parent, stand before a classic Freudian dilemma. Do you respond from your wounded ego fueling the hostility, or do you dive beneath the behavior and see the pain behind the mask? Because in Freud's eyes, every act of contempt is a defense, and every defense hides a wound. So how do you face this without losing yourself to anger, to guilt, to despair? Most parents react on autopilot, not realizing they're being puppeteered by unconscious forces, their child's and their own. The truth is, if you don't learn to recognize the hidden patterns behind these confrontations, you'll keep playing an invisible game, one where both sides lose, and the cost is emotional disconnection, the slow erosion of love. In this video, I will take you deep into the invisible architecture of your child's mind. We'll decode, through the lens of Freudian psychoanalysis, what contempt truly means, and more importantly, what you can do about it, with precision, with empathy, with emotional authority. Because once you see the soul behind the behavior, something extraordinary happens. Respect is no longer demanded. It returns, naturally. When a child looks at their parent with contempt, it is not just defiance, it is a symptom. As Freud taught us, observable behavior is merely the tip of the iceberg, the part the conscious mind allows to surface. Contempt, then, is not the disease, but the signal of an unseen psychic wound begging to be heard. It is the silent cry of an unconscious in distress, seeking, through confrontation, what it perhaps never clearly received: reflection, boundaries, presence. The child who speaks with scorn is often at war with themselves. They carry a fragile, still developing superego, struggling against inner impulses they barely comprehend. By projecting this inner chaos onto their parents, they're trying to regulate it, externalizing confusion in an attempt to gain control. Freud believed that unresolved conflicts from childhood don't just disappear, they return as fate. Contempt, in this light, is a reenactment of earlier relational patterns, a rehearsal of power, love, and rejection. Yet the most common parental mistake is to react with punishment or submission. Neither approach addresses the root. Both reinforce a logic of tension, as if the child were an adversary to conquer or a tyrant to appease. What Freud proposed was symbolic listening, the understanding that behavior is coded language, and only the emotionally grounded adult can decipher it without being consumed by it. It is essential to grasp that the child's unconscious is always at work, longing, fearing, fantasizing. Contempt may be the mask for fear of abandonment, resentment for being unseen, or rage from feeling powerless. The proper response demands more than words. It demands psychic presence. The adult must stop reacting and start observing, not through the wounded ego, but with the sensitivity of someone who understands the abyss of the human soul. And once the parent learns to see beyond the symptom, the game changes. The behavior is no longer a personal attack, but a map that, when read attentively, leads to the origin of the trauma, the root of the emotion, the very rupture between desire and frustration. And it is at this rupture that the possibility of healing begins. In Freudian theory, the self is born in the gaze of the other. The caregiver's look is the first mirror in which the subject begins to recognize themselves. But what happens when that mirror is fractured? When the child sees coldness, absence, or tension in the parent's eyes. They learn unconsciously that love is unstable, conditional, fleeting, and so they react, not with logic, but with defense. In this context, contempt may be a primitive attempt to reclaim power, a way to reverse the pain and become the one who wounds instead of the one who suffers. Like a wounded animal baring its teeth to mask vulnerability, the child lashes out at those they need most, because somewhere along the line, they learned that this was the only way to avoid emotional vanishing. To Freud, repressed affect transforms into symptom, and symptoms always return, through nightmares, psychosomatic illness, or defiant behavior. That's why parents must do more than address what is visible. True transformation begins beneath the surface, where emotion was once distorted, where connection was broken. Contempt is often the inverted reflection of frustrated affection. Love turned into rage, tenderness twisted into provocation. Behind this lies the unconscious image of a parent who failed to hold the emotional space during times of chaos. The child then gives the pain back, not out of malice but out of loyalty to the suffering they endured. The adult who understands this gains a new tool, empathetic listening, not passive acceptance but interpretation, to see behavior as a key. Because every act of contempt, no matter how harsh, is a desperate plea for reconnection, a plea for the mirror to become whole again. Freud viewed life as a stage where the unconscious writes the script and the ego acts, unaware it is merely a character. At home, this theater becomes even more intense. Every gesture, word, and silence is a scene in a drama that began long before any visible conflict. And the child's contempt is just one act, loaded with symbolism and layered meanings beyond the reach of ordinary awareness. The problem is, many parents believe they are operating in the present moment, when in truth they are trapped in past repetitions. The harsh tone you use today may echo the rejection you received from your own father decades ago, and your child's scorn may carry the unspoken anger they feel from not being protected, heard, or emotionally held. Freud's theory of repetition compulsion reveals that the unconscious repeats past trauma in hopes of rewriting it. It's as if the child is saying without words, "This time understand me. This time don't emotionally abandon me." But parents, entangled in their own unresolved pain, respond defensively, repeating the cycle. The same scene plays out, and the ending never changes. The task is to rewrite the script, to disrupt the repetition. This requires not only awareness, but emotional courage. The adult must abandon the role of the victim and become the author of the scene. And for that, they must learn to interpret the hidden storyline. Contempt might be the climax of a narrative where love was always conditional on good behavior, and now the child is testing whether love can survive the chaos. When a parent can remain emotionally present, even in the face of hostility, something shifts. The child realizes they no longer need to hurt to be seen. They learn trust. They begin to believe that love does not vanish at the first sign of rupture, and in that moment, the tragedy transforms into the possibility of redemption. According to Freud, desire is the engine of human behavior, and when desire is frustrated, ignored, or repressed, it does not disappear, it transforms. Often it becomes rage, sarcasm, emotional coldness. The child longs to be seen, understood, admired. And when that longing is met with silence or absence, they lash out, not at the desire itself, but at the figure who denied it, the parent. But desire is not always obvious. Sometimes it hides beneath paradoxical behavior. The child who speaks with contempt may be saying, "See my pain." They may be provoking a reaction that reaffirms their significance, even if that reaction is punishment or conflict, because to the unconscious, being punished is better than being invisible. In this landscape, the adult must become a reader of symbols. They must see aggressive behavior not as the enemy, but as the messenger. Behind arrogance may lie a desperate need for affection. Freud reminded us, the unconscious has no morality, it simply desires. It is the ego's role to interpret, contain, and, if strong enough, transform that impulse into real connection. The therapeutic answer is not to erase contempt, but to offer the original desire a new path, a space where it can be recognized and processed. This does not mean giving the child everything they want, but it means honoring the longing behind the behavior, so it no longer needs to erupt as aggression. When desire is named, anger loses its grip. When affection is restored, behavior changes. And what was once a wall of hostility becomes a bridge of understanding. Freud teaches us that the path to healing always begins with the recognition of unspoken desire, even the kind buried so deeply it never had words. Freud believed that civilization exists only because desire is bounded. The role of limits is not to crush the child, but to help them transform impulse into symbol, rage into language, desire into purpose, pain into meaning. When contempt goes unchallenged, it grows. It turns into cynicism, into widespread disrespect. It dismantles not only the parent-child bond, but the child's very psychic structure. A healthy limit is not shouting, not violence, not threat. It is firmness with presence. It is saying no without emotionally vanishing. It is remaining available, even when the child attacks. Because what they're truly asking is, will you still be here when I show you the worst parts of me? If the answer is yes, not just in words, but in action, then they learn that love can hold chaos. Limits are in fact a form of love, a love that does not cave to emotional blackmail, that does not fear conflict, but protects the symbolic space where the child can grow. Freud viewed the father figure as the one who introduces the law. Not arbitrary law, but the kind that organizes desire. Without that law, the subject becomes lost in their own impulses. The great error of modern parenting is confusing empathy with permissiveness. But a child without limits is a child without psychic boundaries. This breeds anxiety, guilt, self-destructive behavior. In this case, contempt may be the child's desperate attempt to find structure, to test whether anyone can contain their chaos. To set limits with love is to teach the child that frustration is survivable, that their anger can be heard without being feared, that their pain can be acknowledged without the world collapsing. And when that happens, contempt becomes unnecessary, because the bond becomes strong enough to hold the truth. To understand the contempt of a child, one must dare to confront a darker truth, that parents too carry unresolved shadows. Freud argued that we pass down more than just language and habit. We pass down emotional wounds. The child often becomes the mirror not of who we are now, but of who we once were and never healed. And when we are faced with their defiance, it may be our own forgotten pain looking us in the eye. Many parents, without realizing, project onto their children the expectations, guilt, or frustrations they themselves inherited. The child becomes the unconscious repository of unfinished business, living out scripts that were written generations earlier. Freud called this transference, and in the family dynamic it happens not just in therapy rooms, but every day, around dinner tables, in hallway arguments, in silent stares. Contempt may arise when the child senses they are being seen, not for who they truly are, but for who the parent needs them to be. This misrecognition breeds resistance. It creates a rift between the authentic self and the role they are forced to play. And like any subject pushed into a mask too tight, the child will revolt. They will provoke, rebel, reject, even if all they really want is to be accepted as they are. Freud would not blame the child alone. He would turn the mirror gently back toward the parent and ask, what in you has not yet been resolved? Because only the parent who has faced their own inner world, its rage, its shame, its unmet longing, can truly hold space for a child without collapsing into reactivity. Contempt is often an invitation. See me, not your past. Love me, not your projections. The healing begins when the parent dares to step out of their role and into their humanity. When they can say, I've made mistakes, or I see now what I didn't before. In that moment, the child is no longer fighting a ghost, but meeting a human being. And through that meeting, the contempt softens, because the performance of perfection has finally ended. One of Freud's most profound contributions was this: when we give words to what we feel, the symptom loses power. The act of symbolizing, of naming what is raw, confused, or buried, is what transforms psychic pain into meaning. A child who speaks with contempt is in a way still mute, not in sound but in soul. They are speaking around the pain, not through it. What they need is someone who won't fight back, but invite them into language, who won't demand obedience, but offer dialogue. The goal is not to force respect, but to awaken self-awareness, because the child who learns to speak about their rage no longer needs to act it out. When words enter, symptoms exit. This is the alchemy Freud spoke of. But that space must be earned. It cannot be demanded. The adult must show that they are safe enough to receive the child's truth without judgment, without punishment, without control. Only then will the child risk vulnerability. Only then will contempt give way to curiosity. And what was once a war becomes a conversation. This does not mean accepting disrespect. It means seeing beyond it, holding it in a larger frame. It means using moments of conflict as opportunities to model what Freud called working through, the slow, conscious integration of unconscious material. When a parent speaks calmly in the storm, when they reflect instead of react, the child learns that emotion can be contained and therefore understood. In time, the child discovers that language is not just for asking and refusing, but for revealing. And when that happens, the walls fall. The need to dominate disappears. And in its place, a new form of respect is born, not based on fear, but on mutual recognition. In the end, what Freud always brought us back to was this: every symptom is a distorted form of love, even contempt, even rebellion, even silence. These are not the opposite of love, but its failed expressions, born from disappointment, from unmet needs, from the confusion of childhood. And beneath them all, if we dare to look, is still the longing to be held, seen, understood. When a child speaks with contempt, it's because something in the connection has fractured. The bridge has burned. But bridges can be rebuilt, not through authority alone, but through emotional labor, through presence, through truth. The parent must be willing to walk into the ruins of the relationship and begin again, not from power, but from humility. Freud would remind us that nothing in the psyche is ever truly lost. What is repressed returns. What is unloved still longs to be loved. And so the contempt you see today may be the love that was once denied, the closeness that was once broken. It is not too late, not if you are willing to look beneath the mask and meet the child behind it. And when that happens, when the adult meets the child not with ego but with empathy, a miracle occurs. The need for contempt vanishes, the mask drops, and what emerges is not submission but reconnection. A respect that was never taught but discovered, not demanded but given freely. Because in the end, the child who once wounded with words will one day say, "You stayed, you saw me, even when I tried to push you away." And that, Freud would say, is not just healing. It is love, made conscious. At its core, every behavior is a cry for connection. What we often interpret as contempt may in truth be a misunderstood plea. Throughout this journey, we've stepped into the invisible backstage of the human psyche, where Freud taught us that no gesture is without desire, and no hostility exists without history. The child who wounds is often simply trying to find their way back, to themselves and to the love they once felt slipping through the cracks of childhood. And when a parent understands this, something shifts within them too, because to truly understand another is, inevitably, to begin healing oneself. Boundaries, listening, reflection, and language form a quiet dance between past and present, between who we were and who we still have the potential to become. Freud showed us that conscious love requires tremendous courage, the courage to confront one's own wounds so as not to unconsciously pass them on. Contempt is not merely noise in the relationship, it's the echo of something older, deeper, that only dissolves when someone chooses not to react, but to understand. Not to repeat, but to transform. And in that transformation lies the true emotional revolution. When you hold the gaze, even in the face of fury, you are silently saying, "I will not abandon you, not even your pain." That steady presence, free of violence, is the structure every child needs to grow whole. More than technique or theory, it's about simply being there, fully, humanly, consistently. Because real love is not the one that avoids conflict, it's the one that survives it and stays. Maybe in the end, the most important question is not why is my child treating me like this, but what is this pain trying to teach me? When you flip the question, You change the story, and in that new story, your child is no longer the enemy, but the invitation. An invitation to revisit your origins, reframe your reactions, and co-write a new way of loving. Freud said, "What is repressed always returns." But when you name the pain, it comes back as wisdom. So if this message stirred something inside you, if it sparked memories, questions, or even a silent longing to do things differently, don't let it fade. Share what moved you in the comments, send this video to someone who needs it, and subscribe to the channel. Because when you choose to evolve consciously, you don't just change yourself, you reshape the generations that follow. And that, perhaps, is the deepest form of love there is.